Hey film fans, is there anything else we can say about one of the greatest American films of all time? This is a film that's had gallons or barrels of ink spilled about it. It's had special editions in VHS, DVD, Blu-ray. It's been featured in retrospectives around the world. It's had videos made about it, courses taught about it, regularly considered one of the greatest films of all time. What more can I add? I don't know. Let's find out as we continue our look at the seedy side of Hollywood with the 1950 film Sunset Boulevard on this episode of What Makes This Film Great. Hey everybody, before I get going, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, Sunset Boulevard, Billy Wilder. This is a 1950 film about Hollywood. It's a black comedy. It's sometimes described as a film noir, although I would say, as a non-noir expert, that it's kind of an outlier of that genre. Stylistically, it has a lot in common with noir. Narratively, it starts to stray a little bit, but it's a broad genre. It's a Hollywood tale, much like Day of the Locust. Although very different in some ways, there are echoes and they overlap. And just to be clear, Sunset Boulevard's 25 years older than the Day of the Locust, so that's the way the echoes go. But we can look at them as companion pieces in a way, and I'll try to tease out some of those comparisons as we go. I'll just say, for those of you who haven't seen it, turn this video off and go watch it. It is one of the greatest films you'll see. It's from 1950. There are elements about it that might appear dated, both in terms of its storyline, in terms of its production, maybe the score, that sort of old classic Hollywood score might not do it for you these days. But it's a fantastically made, fantastically performed, fantastically told story of the seedy side of Hollywood in ways that are different from the Day of the Locust. What's it about? William Holden plays Joe Gillis. Joe is a kind of down on his luck Hollywood screenwriter. He's had some success. He's had, as he describes it, a couple of B movies, and he's known as a good writer or a quality writer, but he's up against a combination of kind of writer's block, and his style seems to be becoming a bit sort of passé or even cliche. We find this out early when he goes to Paramount and pitches this idea he has for a baseball film, and the head of Paramount calls in the script girl, Betty Schaefer, played by Nancy Olson, and she'll become more important later in the film, to give her opinion on the coverage of this film.
Hello, Mr. Sheldrake.
Hello.
On that basis loaded, I covered it with a 2-page synopsis.
Thank you.
But I wouldn't bother.
What's wrong with it?
It's from hunger.
Nothing for lad?
It was just a rehash of something that wasn't very good to begin with.
I'm sure you'll be glad to meet Mr. Gillis. He wrote it. This is Miss Kramer.
The name is Schaefer. Betty Schaefer. Right now, I wish I could crawl in a hole and pull it in after me.
If I could be of any help.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Gillis, but I just didn't think it was any good. I found it flat and trite.
So in a way, this is kind of like an old Hollywood meet cute, because these two are going to get closer as the film goes. But the point of it at this point, this is only about 10 minutes into the movie, is to show Joe's status. He's washed up. As we talked about with Day of the Locust, Hollywood has eaten him up, and it's just about to spit him out. And after this scene in the Paramount offices, he shops some ideas around to a couple other bigwigs he knows and gets turned away by all of them, including his agent, and has come to the decision that he's going to have to leave Hollywood. He didn't make it. He's going to have to go back to the newspaper where he worked in the small town in Ohio, where his old colleagues are going to laugh at him for failing. As part of being down on his luck, he's out of money. And one of the things that really kicks off the plot is that his car is financed, and a couple thugs from the finance company show up and want to take the car from him. And he keeps trying to get away from them, and eventually they chase him, and he's driving down Sunset Boulevard, and He blows a flat, but he's able to turn off the road. He's ahead of them far enough, and he's able to turn off the road before they kind of notice, and they drive on past. Hollywood logic. And he winds up at this seemingly abandoned old Hollywood pile. And it's this decrepit looking house that we find out later still on the inside is pretty magnificent. And it turns out that this is the home of Norma, Desmond, and her butler, manservant, kind of jack of all trades, Max, played by the great Hollywood filmmaker Erich von Stroheim. And Norma Desmond is a washed up star of the silent era, and she's become a recluse, kind of like a Miss Havisham, and Joe even describes her as such, or her house as such, as he investigates. And this is the beginning of the story, this strange relationship between Norma and Joe. And Norma has been pining for, prepping for, hoping for a comeback. She hates this term, a return. And she sees Joe, at the beginning anyway, as a vehicle to help her. He's a writer. She's been working on a script about Salome, famously the wife of King Herod, who had John the Baptist decapitated. And she, of course, is going to play Salome. And she wants Joe to kind of clean up the script. And so she entices him or coerces him into staying with her in this mansion, working on the script, and trying to get her a shot to make it back in the pictures in a film directed by her old friend Cecil B. DeMille, who plays himself in a memorable late scene or sequence in the film. And this is kind of it. But what ensues is this psychological tale of wounded individuals, both of whom have been chewed up and spit out by Hollywood, but in vastly different ways and for vastly different reasons. Other things are going on that the film wonderfully doesn't spell out. Norma's mental illness, whatever it might be, maybe it's just wild eccentricity. But she certainly has a level of kind of narcissism, but she also has a great deal of depression. But she's also incredibly coy and witty about things. So for example, she promises Joe a lot of money to entice him. He needs money. He can't pay for his car. He can't pay his rent. But she never gives him any money. She does things for him. She goes and pays his rent. She buys him wonderful clothes. She gives him champagne and caviar every day. But she never gives him the money. So she is creating an environment in which at first he feels comfortable, somewhat comfortable, but then is unable to escape. And this is the tension in the film. Can he escape or can he not? As he tries to placate her, please her, in some ways take care of her. It's hard to know if he develops feelings for her or not, if he's just playing. Again, the film doesn't spell this out. There are times when he seems genuinely concerned for her fate. But there are also times when he seems to be in it for the money. And there are also times when he just seems resigned to his fate. He's trapped here. And he moves back and forth between those feelings. And the film never really settles on one, even in the big set piece at the end when he kind of declares his intentions. So that's kind of the main story. There's a very important B story, or maybe it's an equal A story, between Joe and Betty, the script girl. Betty is a wonderful character, a very important character in the film, and she's a script reader, but she wants more. She wants to eventually become a screenwriter, and she has found an old piece of writing by Joe, most of which she doesn't think is very good, but there's one passage that she thinks has a lot of potential.
Now, if I got you correctly, there's a short stretch of my fiction which you found worthy of notice.
the flashback scene in the courtroom when she tells about being a school teacher?
I had a teacher like that once.
Well, maybe that's why it's good. It's true, it's moving. Now, why don't you use
Who
that
wants
character?
true? Who wants movie?
Drop that attitude. Here's something really worthwhile.
Want me to start right away? Maybe there's some paper around.
I'm serious. I've got a few ideas.
And I got a few ideas of my own.
Slowly, she and Joe are going to become writing partners, and she wants to bolster him to say, no, you still got it, stay here. She's engaged to one of his best friends, a Hollywood assistant director, but even with that engagement, she and Joe sort of slowly fall for each other. And so that adds to the tension of Joe at Norma's, because Joe has to sneak away to work on the script with Betty, and Norma's aware that he's sneaking away. She's not happy about it, and this adds to her own kind of paranoia and depression. So these sort of poles of Joe's own self-loathing over his failed career, the quandary he's in over how to deal with his relationship with Norma, and his attraction to, but also resistance to, the hope that Betty holds out for him. Hope for true love, but also hope that he might be able to rekindle that sort of fire about writing that led him out to Hollywood in the first place. And all of these storylines are going on at the same time, and each one of them is simple on its own, but when they're put together in this film, that the tension between them is what creates a lot of its power. Before getting into what makes this film so great, let's just talk a little bit about the cast and crew. As I said, it was directed by Billy Wilder. Wilder is also a co-writer of the film with Charles Brackett, who worked on Wilder with several films, 7 or 8 films, I think. And there's another writing credit that goes to a guy named D.M. Marshman Jr., who only has 3 or 4 screenwriting credits to his name, and apparently got out of Hollywood early and went into advertising. The cinematography is by a guy named John F. Seitz, one of the great cinematographers of the sort of mid-century era. Actually, much earlier. He started in the 20s and he worked on Valentino films and things like that. So 40, 50 years in Hollywood. Who again worked with Wilder on several films, including Double Indemnity and The Long Weekend. One of the great practitioners of film noir cinematography, and also a fascinating figure in the development of camera, lighting, and shooting technology. He has like 100 patents to his name, and he's a fascinating figure. Joseph F. Seitz, go read up on him and find out more. And together, the writing and the directing and the cinematography in this film do things that I love in terms of pushing each other forward, and the performance as well. Everything is working in this film to push the narrative, drive the narrative, but also to complicate the narrative, to enhance the narrative. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But just a few other members of the cast. I already mentioned Holden, Gloria Swanson, Nancy Olson, and Eric von Stroheim, and they kind of make up the main players of the cast. There are several Hollywood figures who play themselves. I said Cecil B. DeMille. There's also an older Buster Keaton, Anna Nilsson, H.B. Warner. These are sort of classic Hollywood figures. Hedda Hopper plays herself, the gossip columnist. And one of the things that this film does really well, I'd say even more so than Day of the Locust, is it creates a sort of realistic verisimilitude with the Hollywood of the 1950s. The dialogue that people engage in, they're always talking about real Hollywood figures, real producers, real performers. And so the sense that they're moving in the actual world of Hollywood is palpable and is one of the wonderful things about the film. I want to talk briefly about Seitz's cinematography, because it's a really important part of the film, because Seitz here is working on several different levels. So a lot of the film, as you would expect in 1950, is pretty standard classical Hollywood coverage. So we have a lot of establishing shots. We have a lot of shot reverse, shot when people are talking to each other. And there's a nice mix of close-ups, some really wonderful long shots, some great long shots through the house from one room into the next room, which really gives you a sense of the enormity of this building. But of course, this is also a kind of a quasi-noir, as I said, and Seitz makes use of noir conventions in fantastic ways. So he'll use these sort of contrasts of shadow and light that are very noirish, but almost like they're tamped down. So they don't jump out at you. It's like, ooh, that's a noir shot. But it is in a way. I mean, it's all coming out of the sort of German expressionism of the 20s and so on, filtered through this American kind of cynical private dick movie of the 40s, and then realizing something slightly different here. And one of my favorite uses of it comes late in the film, actually, on the staircase in Norma's house.
Thank you, darling. Thank you, Joe. Joe.
You just see, and the staircase features in a lot of great shots, including one incredibly famous shot near the end of the film, or at the end of the film. But just the shadows there they're less, I mean, they're obvious and they call attention to themselves, I guess, but they're less menacing than in a standard film noir. And they're less, the contrast is less, so they don't seem to be as obviously foreboding, although they are. And they are throughout the film. When you watch Sunset Boulevard, look at how, gentle's not the right word, but let's just use that, gently shadow and light contrast with each other so that it's still there, but more subtly. I actually watched this recently to prepare for this video, and I showed it to my son. He's 10, and he was watching it, and he said, I know they go outside during the day sometimes, but it always feels like it's night. I thought that was a great little response he had to it, because it does, and you can't always explain why, and a lot of that's the cinematography. And another thing that the cinematography does a few times through the film that I absolutely love, it makes use of these awkwardly blocked shots. And so you get these shots where there's a foreground and there's a background and there's deep focus or nearly deep focus. But the image in the foreground is blocked in such a way that we don't see it. So for example, the first night Joe stays in the mansion, he wakes up and he hears this keyboard music and he goes down to investigate, and this is how it's presented to us.
Whatever your name is, what are my things doing here? I'm talking to you.
I find this shot mildly unnerving. And there's a similar one later, and this is a very important scene at New Year's, and Joe's been staying with her for a while, and she sets up this elaborate New Year's event just for her and him and a band of musicians. And eventually he flees and he goes to a fun party and he gets a call that she's tried to take her own life, and he comes back and we see this. This is how it's presented to us. It's a similar kind of shot, but it's again unnerving. It's like it presents the marks of her sacrifice to us and to Joe, and I think that's very important because there are shots like this throughout the film where just for a second you have to readjust your perspective when you're looking at them. You have to say, wait, what's that? Why are those hands in the foreground? Why are those bandaged wrists in the foreground? That odd choice of framing and blocking and the deep focus and sometimes slightly awkward angles all add up to an unnerving feeling. And that's what I meant earlier when I said that the cinematography complements or pushes or in some ways undermines the writing. If we return to the keyboard shot, something else happens in that sequence, which is a reveal shot, and it looks like this.
What's the matter? Is there anything missing? Who said you could? Who asked you to?
I did. I don't know why you should be so upset. Stop that playing, Max. Seemed like a good idea.
This is an old school Hollywood thing to do. Reveals have been around from the beginning. But the combination of Joe waking up, coming out of a dream, hearing this keyboard music, coming down to that weird shot, having this whole conversation, and then the reveal that Norma's been sitting there the whole time contributes even more to this unnervingness. And it contributes to the sense also on day one that Norma Desmond is in control of this situation. And that is an important visual and thematic element that runs throughout the film. And it may or may not be true, but that's the feeling that she is trying to create in the film. At times supports that, and then again at other times undermines it. But the film starts out undermining your expectations. First in a very simple way, and if you've watched my video on diegetic music, I talk a little bit about this actually, and that's with the opening title. Take a look at this. The opening title of the film is diegetic. Sunset Boulevard, which is the title of the film, is painted there on the roadside curb. It exists in the world and it's the title. But then as the rest of the opening titles roll, they become extra diegetic. So what you have here is a wonderful case of transdiegetic opening titles. And probably most people don't even pay this any attention, but that's a little bit, and I talk more about this in the diegetic video, a little bit unnerving in ways so subtle that you probably don't know, but the film starts that way. That's the beginning of the film. The more famous opening that's also unnerving is the camera moves down Sunset Boulevard. Joe's voiceover starts. He starts talking about himself. He starts talking about this night when things happen. And we slowly move into Norma Desmond's home. We don't know who she is yet. We don't know it's her home yet. This is the establishment of the opening. And we come up on this pool and there's a body floating in the pool. And then we get this wonderful shot.
Nobody important, really. Just a movie writer with a couple of B pictures to his credit. The poor dope. He always wanted a pool. Well, in the end, he got himself a pool.
Fantastic shot. It was actually done, I think, eventually with a mirror because they just couldn't figure out how to get the shot from underwater. So they're shooting down to a mirror reflecting Holden. And if you're a 1950 moviegoer, you know that's William Holden. Wait a minute, that's the star of the film? He's dead. But that's his voiceover. This is just fantastic. You know, you should be going, wait, what? How is he telling this story and dead? It doesn't make logical sense. And then he gives you the old framing device, let me tell you how we got here, right? And the film does make use of a framing device, which is basically a way to say a story within a story. So we start at the end, this has already happened, but then we go back to the days, months actually before that, and we lead up to it and we get to the end. So we've created this frame and we're back there at the end of the narrative, but at the beginning of the film. That's the frame. And it should be unnerving. Films do this all the time. Like, let me tell you how I got here, right? But not with someone who's dead. How can they tell us this story? So from the outset, the film is attempting to make sure that you, the viewer, are on unsteady ground. And that's important because throughout the film, as confident as Joe is, this is William Holden, you know, as confident as he is, or as confident as he tries to appear to be, to mask a lot of his inner insecurities, which we find out from the voiceover, he's never on firm ground, and he won't end on firm ground either. And the film continues to do this throughout. I'm not going to go too much into the story and what happens. It's quite well known. I just want to talk about a couple more scenes and the different ways that the performance and the writing and the cinematography perpetuate this feeling of everything's not as it appears. Because that is the way that Norma keeps Joe enmeshed in this situation, by presenting one face and then presenting another face and then presenting another face, but always with ulterior motives behind them. So whether she's the confident star that's never really been gone, or the depressed, suicidal, victim of Hollywood ageism, or the lovelorn older woman who can't live without her lover boy, whatever role she's playing, I think those roles are real, and I think that is Norma Desmond, but behind it, there's always a calculation. We, in the audience, don't always know. And the film plays with that in lots of really interesting ways. One of the best sequences in the film, which is quite long and I can't show the whole thing, but I'll show a few snippets of it, is when Norma decides to go to Paramount and meet with DeMille. Now, the reason she's doing this is complicated, and I'll show one short scene that sort of explains the complication. But she has submitted her script. So she and Joe have been working on the script of Salome, and she's had Max drive it over to Paramount, hand deliver it to DeMille, which he can't do, but he tries to do. And now she's waiting, and she's convinced that this thing is a masterpiece. And they keep getting calls from this other guy at Paramount, and she's convinced that he's one of DeMille's assistants, and she's getting increasingly frustrated.
Not Mr. DeMille in person. It is someone by the name of Gordon Cole. He says it's very important.
Certainly it's important. It's important enough for Mr. DeMille to call me personally. The very idea of having some assistant call me, say I'm busy, and hang up.
Very good, madam.
So she decides to take matters into her own hand, and they're going to drive over to Paramount. And she has this lovely old-fashioned European car. It's one of the first things Joe notices when he gets to the house. And they drive up to the Paramount lot, and this is what happens at first.
You see, Mr. DeMille, open the gate.
Mr. DeMille is shooting. You got an appointment?
No appointment necessary. I'm bringing Norma Desmond.
Norma who?
Norma Desmond.
Jonesy. Hey, Jonesy.
Yeah?
Why, if it isn't Miss Desmond. How have you been, Miss Desmond?
Open the gate.
Sure, Miss Desmond. Come on, Mac.
They can't drive on the lot without a pass.
Miss Desmond can. Come on.
I love this moment because you have maybe two generations, but also the film is exhibiting two different types of understanding about Norma Desmond. Norma Desmond, throughout the film up to this point, talks about her fame. She talks about how important she was. But because she's in this Miss Havisham style house, because she's a recluse, because she's obsessed with herself and her own fame, her house is full of pictures of herself. She has a screening room where she only watches her old films. It becomes easy as a viewer to think she's exaggerating her importance, right? So when she first gets to the lot and this first security guard's like, I don't care who you are, you can't come in if you haven't got an appointment, you're like, I knew it. That's exactly what would happen, right? But then that's undermined by the older security guard who recognizes her right away. And that then tells us, oh, wait a second, the people who know, maybe she's right. So in those just short couple of minutes, first where our suspicions that she's exaggerating her career and her importance are confirmed, and then immediately undermined. It happens again more extensively, and I can't show the whole thing, when she finally gets in to meet DeMille. DeMille finds out she's there in this fictional real Hollywood. She and DeMille made a lot of films together, and so he respects her. And he's concerned because he's heard the stories. Late in her career, she became difficult, but he mentions, only late in the career, early, she was a joy to work with. She helped to build Paramount, all this sort of stuff. And so we're getting these kind of two sides of her. And then we have these couple of moments when she's in the studio and DeMille's trying to figure out, why is she here and why does she think I'm making her movie?
Excuse. You read the script, of course?
Yes, I did.
Then you could have picked up the telephone yourself instead of leaving it to one of your assistants.
Hmm? What assistant?
Now, don't play innocent. Somebody named Gordon Cole.
Gordon Cole?
And if you hadn't been pretty darn interested in that script, he wouldn't have tried to get me on the telephone 10 times.
Gordon Cole? Look, Norma, I'm in the middle of a rehearsal. Now, why don't you just sit up here in my chair and make yourself comfortable, hmm?
Thank you.
That's the girl. Yeah. I won't be a moment. Bring me a telephone and get me Gordon Cole.
Right.
Hey, Miss Desmond! Miss Desmond! It's me! It's Hog-Eye!
Hello, Hog-Eye.
Let's get a good look at you.
Look, there's Norma Desmond.
Norma Desmond. Norma Desmond.
Why, I thought she was dead.
How nice to see you.
Welcome home, Mr. You remember me, don't you?
Miss Desmond.
So you see, on the one hand, DeMille is convinced this is all some sort of game. He doesn't know what's going on. How could she think she's making the movie? The people around him think she's washed up. What is she doing here? And we're like, well, yeah, of course, because we've seen her for an hour being that person. But then this adoration from everyone on the set. It's playing with this understanding of who Norma Desmond is. And then we get one more key moment during this set visit, which is when Max is outside by the car waiting for Norma.
Hey, here's that funny car Gordon Cole was talking about.
Yeah.
Mind if we look it over?
What's so funny about it?
They never wanted her, right? We've been kept guessing because we've been wondering who this guy Gordon Cole is. And the film just leads us to believe he's a DeMille assistant, but he's somebody totally different. So again, the rug is kind of pulled out from under us, just as it's pulled out from under Max and eventually pulled out from under Norma. So this is another way that the film keeps us, discombobulated throughout. And it's performance, it's narrative, it's cinematography, it's all of those things. Betty's story is another way that that's done. And Betty's story is fascinating. She first appears as this sort of go-get-'em script girl. She's going to say what she really thinks, and I've showed you that scene earlier. And throughout the film, she plays this sort of tough as nails broad, but also someone who's very soft. She plays these games with Joe where he's flirting with her. He's actually flirting with her. She's engaged to his friend, so she's just playing along, but she's also falling for him. So when does her playfulness turn into reciprocation? And that's a dance that the film does for quite a long time. And while she's presented as this kind of typical, just like Joe, I'm going to come out to Hollywood and make my way, eventually we get this really interesting story about her background.
Well, I was born just 2 blocks from the studio, right on 11 Grove Avenue. My father was head electrician here till he died. Mother still works in wardrobe.
Second generation, huh?
Third. Grandma did stunt work for Pearl White. I come from a picture family. Naturally, they expected me to become a great star. So I had 10 years of dramatic lessons, diction, dancing. Then the studio made a test. Well, they didn't like my nose. Slanted this way a little. So I went to a doctor and had it fixed. They made more tests and they were crazy about my nose. Only they didn't like my acting.
I love this story because it's continually bobbing and weaving around what we thought about Betty. The whole story about her nose job, the whole story about all of her training to become an actor, the whole story about her being from sort of Hollywood royalty, or let's say semi-royalty, undermines the way she's been presented throughout the film already. And it really deepens her character in ways that suddenly, for me at least, as I'm watching, I see Betty as this kind of like a foil to Joe, like a kind of quasi-student mentor. She wants to learn from him, but she also has to keep pushing him. She's kind of vacillates back and forth between those two roles. And then with this story, her whole character opens up. And in some ways, the last third of the movie is almost as much Betty's story as it is Joe's story, as she makes these momentous decisions in her life to leave Artie, who's also Joel's friend, to go with Joel, to sort of throw her eggs in that basket, and then to be rejected by Joe, which is the great heartbreaking scene, which I'll show you in a moment. But before we get to that, there's one last kind of twist that is fascinating, and that's the revelation of Max's background. Max is Norma's guy, her body man, we might call him today. He drives her everywhere, he brings her food, he protects her from ne'er-do-wells, he protects her from the outside world. He doesn't want to tell her that she wasn't called to meet DeMille because her script is so great, but rather for her car. He wants to protect her from everything. This is part of the tension that grows between him and Joe, and he seems, perhaps because of his accent, perhaps because of his stature, certainly because of the way Norma treats him, as somebody who sees Norma as this great woman because she's given him this opportunity. And then we get this.
We're not helping her any. Feeding her lies and more lies. Getting herself ready for a picture. What happens when she finds out?
She never will. That is my job, and it has been for a long time. You must understand, I discovered her when she was 16. I made her a star, and I cannot let her be destroyed.
You made her a star?
Yes. I directed all her early films. There were 3 young directors who showed promise in those days. T.W. Griffith, Cecil B. DeMille, and Max von Mayerling.
And she's turned you into a servant.
It was I who asked to come back, humiliating as it may seem. I could have continued my career, only I found everything unendurable after she had left me. You see, I was her first husband.
This story is important not just because it's a twist about Max and his background. Oh, he was her first great director and her first husband, and what? What? It's indicative of Norma's manipulative abilities. And this is the moment in the horror movie where you find out the killer's inside the house. This is the moment, I think, for me, where the depths of Norma's character, but also the depths of her machinations, the ability she has to manipulate things, becomes really apparent. And you have to think back on the whole film at this point and see that everything she's been doing to Joe, it hasn't just been like the surface emotions she expresses. Oh, Joe, don't leave me, I couldn't take it. Or, why did you go? I had to try to kill myself. It's something much deeper, something much more abusive, manipulative, cruel. And one of the tough things about the film is, does she know what she's doing? Is this a sort of mental illness that prevents her from empathizing with the people around her, so she just sees them as puppets, a kind of sociopathology or something like that? Or is she actually quite aware of what she's doing? And this is what makes her such a fascinating character to watch. And I think we can compare her with Faye from Day of the Locust in a couple ways. And first, before I do that, I just want to be clear that I don't think either Faye or Norma are simply metaphors or even ciphers. They're both fully realized characters, fascinating, complicated, damaged characters, damaged by Hollywood, and probably other things too, but certainly by Hollywood. But they are also, in a way, metaphors for Hollywood, or a certain aspect of Hollywood. So I mentioned in the Day of the Locust video that Faye is can be read as a metaphor for the allure of Hollywood, in the way that she's gorgeous and beautiful and flirtatious, but she won't commit to any of the men who are falling in love with her. And you could read that as kind of like Hollywood that's saying, come out here, but never fulfills its promise to most of the people who follow the dream. Norma's something different. Norma's that component of Hollywood that says, here you go. Isn't this wonderful having this money, this lavish lifestyle? The cars, the suits, the caviar, and so on. But if you want to hold on to that, you have to do what I say. You have to be at my beck and call. You have to give your life to me. And that's a different type of Hollywood manipulation and a different type of, in the end, rejection. Because that person or that Hollywood is going to squeeze the life out of you. And when you're used up, the suits, the caviar, the car, the house are gone. And the reason it's such a powerful metaphor for both Faye and Norma is that while Faye is a metaphor for Hollywood's rejection, she's also rejected by Hollywood. And while Norma is a metaphor for that Hollywood that uses you for all you've got and then is done with you, that's also what's been done with her. And that's what creates the pathos around her character. So you watch Norma Desmond manipulate Joe, manipulate Max, as we find out, and you're like, oh my God, this woman's crazy. How could you do this? But also, this is what's been done to her. This is what she knows. And it's heartbreaking. And when she finally kind of snaps at the end, it's horrific and incredibly sad. This is kind of the power of the ending of this film. It's a sad horror story. And finally, I'd like to look briefly at the breakup scene between Joe and Betty. And this is another twist, I think, although astute viewers would probably see it coming. But it's an important scene for the way it kind of finally pulls the rug out from under the character of Joe. And this is where, as I said, maybe this becomes more about Betty's story than Joe's, even though maybe that's a stretch. Let me know what you think. Betty's given up everything. She's broken it off with Artie, and she's decided that, you know, Joe, she's in love with Joe. They're gonna have this great relationship, romantic relationship, working relationship. But she's been getting prank called by Norma, unbeknownst to her, because Joe hasn't told her throughout the film anything about Norma, about living with Norma, about working for Norma, about being in this kind of boy-toy relationship with Norma, or whatever it might be. So she has no idea who this person calling her is, and Joe intervenes and he gets on the phone with Betty. He tells her where he lives and says, come over. She comes over and we get this.
I didn't come here to see a house. What about Norma Desmond?
That's what I'm trying to tell you. This is an enormous place. 8 master bedrooms. A sunken tub in every bathroom. There's a bowling alley in the cellar. It's lonely here, so she got herself a companion. Very simple setup. Older woman who's well-to-do. A younger man who's not doing too well. Can you figure it out yourself?
No.
All right, I'll give you a few more clues.
No. I haven't heard any of this. I never got those telephone calls, and I've never been in this house. Now get your things together and let's get out of here.
All my things? All my 18 suits, all my custom-made shoes, and the 6 dozen shirts, and the cufflinks, and the platinum keychains, and the cigarette cases?
Come on, Joe.
Come on, where? Back to a one-room apartment I can't pay for? Back to a story that may sell and very possibly will not?
If you love me, Joe.
Look, sweetie, be practical. I've got a good deal here. A long-term contract with no options. I like it that way. Maybe it's not very admirable. Well, you and Artie can be admirable.
I can't look at you anymore, Joe.
In a lot of ways, although the films are very different, this reminds me of the breakup scene in Dangerous Liaisons when John Malkovich keeps saying to Michelle Pfeiffer, it's beyond my control. Betty doesn't collapse to quite the same sort of dramatic effect as Michelle Pfeiffer does there, but the feeling is the same. She is being demolished by this aspect of her lover's life that she knew absolutely nothing about. So not only has the breakup come out of nowhere, Joe's behavior has come out of nowhere. And not only has Joe's behavior come out of nowhere, but the situational context for why Joe might behave this way, for why he might prefer the riches and the clothes and the food, is coming out of nowhere. She's just blindsided by everything about this. And it's brutal, and it's Joe's brutality. I think in a way it's probably meant to prepare the audience for Joe's demise. We've been watching this film and seeing him slowly sort of manipulated throughout by Norma, throughout which time he's appeared to be the victim, and he is. But we need to see his heel turn so that those bullets in the back don't, become totally devastating or seem, too much for 1950 Hollywood. But also it's kind of the heart of the movie, because Norma, despite her depth, despite her layers, despite the sadness around her, has always remained at arm's length for us. And our empathy for her has always been sort of conditional on how she's treating Joe, how lucid she seems in the situation, and so on. Our empathy for Joe has derived from his kind of sad sack presentation of himself, which is helped immensely by the voiceover, and the sense that, oh no, what has he gotten himself into? But the fact is, he's gotten himself into it. He's made the decision all along to stay at Norma's, to accept the clothes, to accept the wealth, to accept the conditions. So when he finally makes this heel turn, it's deriving out of his character, his decisions, his, that he's kind of okay with this. He's not, and he is. He's okay with it enough to let it determine this course of actions. Whereas for Betty, she's come into her relationship with Joe seemingly open-eyed, but with blinders on, blinders created by his dishonesty, his withholding of the truth. And so while we can empathize with Joe and feel like, God, what a horrible situation he's gotten himself into, the real pain here is Betty's. And maybe at the end, the real pain is what Hollywood has done to these people. Thanks for watching, everybody. So I'm not sure in the end if I've added anything to the sort of 70-year-old discussion of Sunset Boulevard, but it was fun to rewatch. I hadn't seen it in a while, and fun to talk about with you. Let me know what you think about it. Do you have any fresh takes on Sunset Boulevard? What do you think about other Billy Wilder movies? Anything you want to share in the comments, I'm happy to read about. As I said at the top, if you're here now, please like, please subscribe, and as I always ask, share this with your movie-loving friends. Thanks everybody for watching. My name's Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.